We're going to tackle something today which might just have the average punter, of which I'm one, have their eyes glaze over, because you start hearing about productivity and go, productivity, what? Because it's not easily consumed. So it's a really important part of the conversation, or it should be. It might be avoided because it's, there's a little bit to it. But when a listener hears the words product or the word productivity, what should they think about? What should they consider that to mean?
Okay, so productivity is basically how much you produce given a certain amount of input. So just to give a really simple example, if you're a barista and you can make 100 coffees an hour, and you get a new piece of a new coffee machine or something that's faster and more efficient, and suddenly you can produce 110 coffees per hour, your productivity's gone up 10%. And, if you do that across the economy, across all goods and services areas of production, that's basically what productivity is. And it's actually the number one driver of living standards over the long term. Because, obviously if you can produce more stuff and more goods and services with less effort, you end up being better off. So you sell more goods to the world, goods and services to the world. You can also have more stuff in your house. You can also work less because you can do the same as what you could do before, but for less effort. So it's basically the number one driver of living standards over the long term. And unfortunately, Australia's productivity growth has been absolutely appalling over the past decade or so. And our productivity growth averaged 0.2% a year, which is shocking. Like that compares to a long-term average of about 1.2 to 1.5%. And Australia's productivity growth has actually been amongst the very worst in the advanced world over the last decade. And we've got the usual blame game. Labor's blaming the coalition, the previous government for the poor productivity. Coalition blames the current government. They're both promising higher productivity growth going forward. Blah blah blah. All the usual political stuff.
Yeah.
But I just thought I'd give a quick rundown about why Australia's productivity sucks.
Please do.
And then also what this election means for productivity going forward.
Yep.
Which isn't actually a good picture. I'll get to that. So, I basically put down Australia's productivity collapse down to 5 main causes. So one of them was in the 2000s we had the epic mining boom. So what happened was Australia's dollar was pushed to really high levels. So, listeners might remember when $1 Australian dollar could buy $1.10 US cents in around 2010, 2011. And what that actually did was it made our manufacturing much less competitive. And it meant that we had a shrinkage in manufacturing because our goods became a lot less competitive in the global market because our currency was so high. And manufacturing is across economies is one of the biggest drivers of productivity growth because it's subject to global competition. It relies on capital investment and technological advancements, and it's one of the areas where you tend to get high productivity growth because next year you can produce more than you did the previous year, and you become more efficient. But unfortunately, Australia's manufacturing share, it's been in terminal decline for decades. So in the mid-1970s, about 15% of our economy was manufacturing. Now it's shrunk to the lowest in the advanced world at about 5%. And the high Australian dollar was one of the causes, not the only causes. The second main cause is, in the mid-2000s, the federal government massively increased immigration, so more than doubled it. And we've had this Big Australia high immigration program running for 20 years. And what that's meant is that Australia's population has grown a lot faster than business investment, the amount of houses we've built and infrastructure. And that's left workers with less capital and it's reduced productivity. So to go back to my cafe example, if you've got 2 baristas who are sharing a coffee machine, they can make 200 coffees in an hour, and then you double the number of baristas to 4 using that one coffee machine, you're not going to double the amount of coffees you can make. You're actually going to have less coffees per barista because you're going to get congestion, they're going to bump into each other, they're going to have to wait for each other to use the machine, etc. That's effectively what Australia's economy has done. So we've grown the population by 8.7 million people this century on the back of high immigration. So that's since 2000. And we haven't expanded the infrastructure to go with it. The businesses haven't expanded their business investment. We haven't built enough houses. And as a result, we've had less productivity growth because, workers have got less machines to work with and other stuff and equipment and whatever. And we've had more congestion on the roads and all that sort of stuff, which makes you less productive. So that's cause number 2. Cause number 3 is we've had this big expansion in the non-market economy. So because of things like the NDIS, etc., we've had a massive increase in government-funded jobs. And government-funded jobs tend to be far less productive than private sector jobs because they're not subject to competition. And in the government-funded sector, they call it the non-market sector, productivity growth has not increased for 20 years. Right, so we've had a massive. I know it's shocking. It is shocking. So the non-market sector's labour productivity is the same as it was in 2005, whereas in the market sector, the productivity growth's gone up about 15% over the same time. So in the private sector. So obviously, if you increase the number of workers who are working in these government-funded jobs, you're going to get less productivity across the economy.
Yeah.
Number four, this is a big one. This is one I talk about all the time: high energy costs. So, a lot of this comes down to the push for renewables, but also the failure to reserve East Coast gas. East Coast Australia has had a 3 times increase in gas prices and around roughly similar increase in electricity prices over the past decade. And as a result, our manufacturing has shrunk even more. So we've obviously seen, last plastics manufacturer Quenos, last architectural glass maker Oceanic Glass, a whole bunch of other manufacturers go bust because of high energy prices, and that's then impacted our productivity because obviously if you have expensive energy, you're not as competitive with the rest of the world when you try and sell stuff. So you become less productive. And finally, we've obviously had this massive pivot towards housing speculation. So back in 1990, Australia's banks lent 2/3 to businesses, about 1/4 to housing, and the rest was for personal loans. Nowadays, banks lend 2/3 to housing and only 1/4 to businesses, or roughly 1/3 to businesses. So we've obviously had this massive house price appreciation. We've poured more and more of the nation's capital into housing. We've now got one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. It's worth it's worth 11.3 trillion. The average home in Australia, so that's apartment houses, etc., is now $1 million. And housing's worth 4.5 times Australia's economy versus 1.7 times the US economy. So and what that's meant is banks, etc., have lent less to productive businesses, which means you become less productive because you're not funding business properly. You're just pouring all your funding into housing, which is non-productive.
Gotcha.
So, that's basically the 5 causes of why Australia's productivity sucks. But the question is, what's going to happen going forward? Now, I'd argue that assuming the Labor Party gets in, we're going to have, and to be honest, the situation wouldn't be much different if the Liberal Party got in, except we get cheaper energy.
Yes.
But, assuming the Labor Party gets in, which is what all the polls are going to say, Australia's long-term outlook for productivity is very poor because, first of all, the latest population growth forecast from the Treasury Centre for Population says we're going to grow the population by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. So that's Sydney. So if you imagine Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane currently, we're going to add the number of people in those 3 cities in the next 40 years. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to build enough infrastructure to rebuild Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in 40 years. We're not going to have enough housing, which means that this whole capital shallowing problem that I alluded to earlier is going to get worse, which means we're going to have less productivity, more congestion on the roads. They're not going to have as much, workers won't have as much capital, much equipment to work with, etc. They're going to become less efficient. Second, obviously, the Albanese government's refused to emulate the Coalition's East Coast gas reservation policy, which means that the East Coast gas price is currently about $12 a gigajoule at the moment, and gas is one of the price setters for electricity. And once we start importing gas, which is scheduled towards the end of the year or early next, the East Coast gas price is likely to go up to about $20 a gigajoule because it'll be import parity prices. It'll be the global price. And what that means is that obviously, the cost of energy going up, our manufacturing is going to continue shrinking, and we're going to become less globally competitive, which means we're going to have less productivity. So that's obviously a downside as well. But also, finally, the Albanese government's committed to pumping up house prices even more because it's promised all first home buyers that they'll be able to buy a home with only a 5% deposit, with taxpayers guaranteeing 15% of their loans. And all that means is that first home buyers are going to have smaller deposits, going to borrow more money, and they're going to bid up house prices, which means that banks are going to be funneling even more money into property, which means they're going to fund less into businesses. So our entire economy is going to be tilted even more to the housing market.
Jeez.
And, the average home price now is $1 million, and the housing the value of Australia's housing stock's 4.5 times the economy, $11.3 trillion. Well, that's likely to go up even higher, which means we're going to have even more of the nation's capital pumped into this, basically places to live, which isn't productive. So, in short, the picture is pretty bleak, Luke. You're looking at ongoing high immigration and population growth, overrunning infrastructure and everything else. You're looking at higher energy costs, which are going to make us less diversified as an economy as we deindustrialise. And you're also looking at, more of the nation's capital being pumped into housing, places to live rather than building businesses and creative stuff. So it's a pretty bleak.
It's a bleak outlook. It's a bleak outlook. It absolutely is. Mate, I've got to fly. Thank you. We'll talk to you next week, Leith. We always learn so much. And if you're listening to Leith there, go through that detail. It's important because if you go back to where we began, the economy can produce. I mean, they love to talk about cutting things. If you don't cut things, then our kids, grandkids, their kids end up paying the bills. But if you can make the economy more productive and you can generate more income into it, then why wouldn't you do this stuff? Every Saturday when I speak to Leith, there is a deluge of messages saying, the government listen to this bloke. It would seem on the basis of the available evidence they don't, and it would also appear to me that they should. Macro